The dictator, Santa Anna, had covered Mexican arms with no glory in Texas. Now he added disgrace by placing his own safety before the honor of his country. He bargained with Houston, ordering the other Mexican columns to retire below the Rio Bravo and signing a convention by which he agreed to commit the supreme government to recognize Texan independence. The victory at the San Jacinto was particularly decisive because the other generals lacked initiative, and also the whole Mexican army, confronted with a burnt-out country, was in logistical difficulty. Santa Anna had not prepared for an extended campaign. Some parts of his army had started to retreat even before Santa Anna's defeat. All of it arrived ragged and hungry south of the Rio Bravo. Once he had squeezed all the advantage he could from Santa Anna, Houston sent him home by way of Washington. Disgraced, he retired to his hacienda at Jalapa. His agreements with Houston meant nothing because the conservative Congress at the capital immediately repudiated them, asserting continued Mexican sovereignty over Texas. However, the ruling conservatives were too fragmented and too involved in local power struggles to reassert Mexican sovereignty in the only practical way, by dispatching new armies. Houston's army of 1,000 men melted away as the colonist militia returned to their farms, but the victory at the San Jacinto was allowed to stand. Texas remained independent not because the United States protected it for 10 years, but because Mexicans of this era did not truly believe in an imperial destiny above the Rio Bravo and had no effective leadership. A struggling little enclave of 30,000 immigrants separated Texas from Mexico because Mexico was still a sprawling territory that contained 7 million inhabitants without a developed sense of nationhood. A unified nation, under a powerful leadership, could have avenged San Jacinto within months. Here, every Mexican patriot began to eat the bitter bread of national doubt and humiliation, and the urge to find excuses in North American plots and myth of overwhelming Nordic numbers was irresistible. Mexico had failed as an empire, and the first failure prevented Mexico from effectively challenging the United States' role upon the continent. Although Mexico was still building toward nationhood, the failure was damaging to pride and created a national trauma that would not die. And that is from the great Texan historian T.R. Fehrenbach's Fire and Blood, one-volume history of Mexico. I'm Josh Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I'm here with Joshua Treviño, the Foundation's Chief of Intelligence and Research. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, Melissa.
And I know we have a lot of material to cover today, but I really want to start with something from that passage that you just read, and that is that one of the reasons that Texas has been able to remain independent was because of Mexico's lack of unity, their lack of effective leadership, and this is a quote, no developed sense of nationhood.
Right.
So this week, on Thursday, Texas is celebrating its 187th anniversary of independence.
We sure are.
But I want to bring something up, and that is, what about Mexico?
Yeah.
All of this time later, what does Mexican nationhood or nationalism look like?
Yeah. Ultimately, something to be decided by Mexicans, obviously. And national identity is always a conversation within a community, and that's true as much for Texans as it is for Mexicans. Fehrenbach really kind of put its finger on the pulse of at least one strand of Mexican nationalism when he talked about vis-a-vis the Texas defeat, the need to create this mythos of inevitable American superiority and kind of this, he terms it in kind of, racial ethnic terms, this Nordic, he calls it. I don't think Fehrenbach uses that anywhere else, but supposedly that's kind of the Mexican take. You can actually see this in modern Mexico today. If anybody goes and visits one of two spots in Mexico City today, there's either the Museo de las Intervenciones, which is at the old Churubusco convent, which kind of chronicles the history of foreign interventions in Mexico. Or if you go to the National History Museum, which is now, it's in Chapultepec Castle, it's very easy to find the persistence of kind of this mythos of what I'll term kind of Mexican state victimhood at the hands of other powers. Last time I was at Chapultepec, which was not terribly long ago. It was summer of 2022. I went up there, and they actually had some new exhibits there. They've actually got this Texan flag that they took from Texas revolutionaries during I believe it was from an Alamo unit, and so you can see it. They've got the flag on display. So as a Texan, I have to admit, I briefly considered breaking the glass and taking it back. I probably would have gotten about 10 feet before that happened.
Not far.
But no, not far. But they have it, and in fairness to them, they did win it. But when you read the descriptions of these periods of history, the Texas Revolution and the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848 in particular, you see this narrative come forth. And on the latter count, this is almost verbatim, but the way in which the text explains it to museum goers, and keep in mind this is as close to like an official narrative as you get in Mexico, is that it was always, I won't attempt the Spanish, but it was always an unequal contest because the United States had the best armies in the world and the best military in the world in 1846. Which is in candor absolutely preposterous. The United States did not have the best army in 1846. In fact, it had a very unready military, although we accomplished prodigious things in the course of the Mexican campaign. But at the same time, if you were to enter into, say, the beginning of 1846 and try to assess the relative military capacities of Mexico versus the United States, I think a fair assessment would have been that Mexico obviously had some tremendous political issues. Texas was not the only region of Mexico to try and break away during the decade, basically following the First Empire. So you've got late 1820s, early 1830s. You had, the Yucatan, which ended up in kind of the 70-year caste war. You had Zacatecas. You had the Republic of the Rio Grande, which is kind of the old Nuevo Santander settlement, and Texas itself. And I'm probably leaving out one or two in that. But there was this period of spinning apart that had everything to do with Mexican politics and much, much less to do with foreign intervention. But in all this, you would have to look at the Mexican military establishment at the beginning of 1846 and say that Mexico actually had a reasonably credible military establishment. It was a military establishment that had defeated at least a couple of European powers, depending on how you wanted to, count it. I don't know if you term the outcome of the Pastry War. And it was a military establishment, by the way, that in decades to come would end up defeating the military efforts of the French Empire as well. So not at all a non-credible force. And this idea that the United States simply was able to overwhelm Mexico at the end of tremendous supply lines. You look at the Battle of Buena Vista, for example, which Americans remember as an American victory. In Mexico, and I believe it's called, I'm going to get this wrong, I believe it's known as La Batalla de Angostura in Mexico. But in Mexico, it's remembered as a Mexican victory. And the reason is that the Americans were effectively defeated on the field, and then Santa Anna, with his kind of characteristic strategic wisdom, elected to leave without completing the destruction of Zachary Taylor's army, which he probably could have achieved at that point. So in no fashion, this is what I'm getting at, was there any sense in which like the fighting quality and the valor and the endurance of the Mexican military really inferior to what the United States had. I mentioned the convent at Churubusco, which itself was the site of a battle between invading American forces and defending Mexicans during the Mexico City campaign. Churubusco is famous, and I'm trying to recall who the Mexican general was. I want to say Nicolas Bravo, but I'll have to double check that. Any podcast listeners correct me on this. But let's say it was General Bravo, because this is a great quote. When the Americans, they fight, they can't take the convent, which is being defended by the Mexicans, and then the Mexicans essentially sue for parley, and kind of to American surprise. And so the American commander tells the Mexicans, well, first you must surrender your ammunition. And the Mexican general, which we're going to say for the sake of argument was General Bravo, replies, well, if we had ammunition, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because they were determined to resist to the end. And that is a quality, sort of, to expand our lens to current day Mexico, that's a quality you see throughout Mexican history. Terrific endurance, absolute, your real patriotic integrity, to kind of get to your question of Mexican nationhood, that is almost always ill-served by the elites in charge, who prove themselves time and again unworthy of the nation that they lead. So to get back to your original question, What does Mexican nationalism look like? There are many strands of it, and we can talk about that. There's different traditions in Mexican, just as there are in American nationalism, and to a lesser extent in Texan nationalism. But one of the things that we, if we ask ourselves, is Mexico a nation? In 2023, we have to say unquestionably yes. And I would argue, broadly speaking, that, could you say it post-independence in the 1820s? Probably. Mm-hmm. You absolutely could say it by the time Benito Juarez kicks out the French. 100% you could say Mexico is a nation. Now, Mexico as a nation is it's a nation with levels, right? So, Mexico has a tremendous indigenous population. It's got a tremendous European population. The heterogeneity of Mexico is shocking, I think, to those who have never been there, who don't fully understand it. You know this firsthand. In Bolivia, it's a very, very similar situation.
Yeah.
So Mexico is always going to have these cross currents. For my money, and this is not, this will expose me as kind of your average Netflix watcher, but for my money, one of the best expositions of sort of the class structure of Mexican society is going to be Cuarón's Roma, which came out in, what year was it, 2018? I believe.
I think so.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So within the past 5 years or so,
It's
an outstanding
pretty recent.
film. If you've got Netflix, I have no relationship with Netflix, so I get nothing from this. But you should take the time to watch Roma. It's a great piece of art, but it's also a very good kind of illumination of how class works in Mexico, and how there really is still 500 years after the conquest,
Right.
a stark division between the Europeos, the Europeans, and los indígenas, and the two are not the same. And so if there's any kind of fracture, I would say, in Mexican nationhood, it's really along those lines.
Right.
And but that does not mean there is no Mexico. Quite the opposite.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Absolutely. And I actually do want to go back in a little bit
Please.
to some of the many parallels that we do have between the current presidency in Mexico of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and what's been happening in Bolivia for
Absolutely.
until 2019, 14 years. And I do want to go back to that. But one of the reasons that I asked you about Mexican nationhood is because right now there's all this talk about the inner workings of Mexico now. And recently we were just talking about this article that came out last week, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. I know we were just talking about this, but it's Joan Grillo's article.
Yes.
So if we're wrong, if any of our listeners can correct us, we have not been able to figure it out.
Joan Grillo, yeah.
But he is a security researcher, and he published this article on Mexico and whether it is a narco state.
Yeah.
And before I ask you, do you think that Mexico is a narco state? I really want to tie it to current events and to something that happened last week. So on Tuesday, we finally got a conviction in this Genaro Garcia Luna case.
Yes, we did.
Which is absolutely, well, it's got two components, right? Because part of it is absolutely nuts. That the equivalent of like the head of the FBI and also a cabinet level position was actually working with the cartels that he promised to help destroy.
Yeah.
So part of that is nuts. But the second component is it's actually not that shocking because it's something that we've seen so many times in Mexico, and it goes right to the core to what we work on here. And that's saying that the Mexican government and the Mexican drug cartels have a partnership. And unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So given that background, do you think that the current Mexico is a narco state? And I actually do have the actual definition if you want it, but I don't think that you need it.
Actually, I think for the benefit of the listeners, tell us the definition. What's
So the definition by Oxford Reference describes a narco state as a nation state whose government, judiciary, and military have been effectively infiltrated by drug cartels, or where the illegal drug trade is covertly run by elements of the government.
Yeah. So by the dictionary definition, right? Or sorry, this is the Oxford dictionary definition. Okay.
Yep.
By the, I'd be interested what the RAI official Spanish dictionary has to say. Unquestionably, Mexico is a narco state. Now, Juan Grillo. So you and I have spent, for the benefit of the listeners, this man's name. He's a Mexico City resident. His last name is spelled Grillo.
Yes.
And so you and I have been calling him
Grillo.
Juan Grillo all week, but it turns
Yeah.
out he's British. So Juan Grillo doesn't agree with this. He has this very nice metaphor. He's got this narco politics Substack, and he has this nice metaphor of Mexico as essentially Mexican governance being a forest, and some of the trees are poison and some of the trees are good. And so he gives the example that, the lights stay on and the trash gets collected and people go to work and they have lives, all of which is true. That's usually true in classic narco states as well. It was true in Panama in 1989, which is definitely a narco state.
Well, and the first narco state ever is Bolivia. That's the first time the term was ever used.
You mentioned that earlier, and I hadn't heard that before. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I wasn't familiar with that background at all.
So I think it was 80, 81. We had this presidency of Luis Garcia Mesa. And it's funny because we talked about this, I believe we talked about this last episode, how a lot of the time history can repeat itself and we see similar cycles. But under that presidency, there was the government actively working to push cocaine to Americans. It was like a cocaine state. And that's the first time that you ever see the term narco state being used. And it's very interesting because a lot of time has passed since the 80, 81.
Sure.
And more recently in 2019, up until November 2019, we had yet another dictator who is Evo Morales. And under him, Bolivia was a full-blown narco state.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of similarities with Mexico in the sense that, like, not to make straight up accusations or anything like that, but Mexico did take Evo Morales in when he had to flee Bolivia in 2019.
That's right.
After this failed electoral fraud.
And it was a Mexican Air Force aircraft.
Yes.
Flew to Bolivia to retrieve him.
Oh, like a celebrity.
Yeah.
And there's all of this. There's all of these videos of him arriving and they're like cradling each other's faces. It's very interesting. But one of the things that you saw in Bolivia was the Mexican president was actually the head of the coca growers, producers. Like he was very actively involed in this.
Which is we should make clear for the listeners, a legit above the ground organization there. Yeah.
Yeah, the coca growers. I mean, my family, my friends, coca is like a medicinal leaf. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Bolivia is very high in altitude, so a lot of the time we'll take coca leaves when we're going up to El Alto, to the capital, to La Paz. It's totally normal, but there's no money in it. It's like very indigenous medicinal. Where there is money in is producing it and exporting it and making it into cocaine.
And refining it, yeah.
And the government is very much involved in that. You see so many examples similar to Mexico of them. In Mexico, you see like a lot of the collusion, a lot of the looking the other way. In Bolivia, we had so many people that were working for the government. I'm not kidding, Josh. Even the president's priest was caught with so much cocaine.
Really?
Like it was very much like an operation, a big operation.
We really need to get a sponsorship for the podcast from the Cocaine Bear movie makers.
The cocaine, it's so bad, by the way. I saw it yesterday.
Oh, you saw it?
Yes.
Oh, good. Wow.
I have a movie pass, so it was free, so I figured I might as well watch it, but I wish I hadn't. And please do not watch it.
I'm sorry to hear that because it looks amazing.
It's so bad. But anyway,
to
get back on the topic, one of the things that you see, one of many parallels that you see with Evo Morales and AMLO is democracy and how that's happened. And so in Bolivia, our presidents before could only run for one term. You couldn't do two back to back.
Right.
And then there was a change where you could do two back to back, but it began during his presidency that you could do two terms back to back. He actually ended up running a third term because he said that not being able to run again was them interfering with his human rights.
It was a human rights case that he made. Yeah.
And then the fourth one, he illegitimately ran again. And there was all of this research that went into it. It was claimed to be fraud. Like even the OAS looked into it and said that there was like a lot of irregularities. But he came out, declared victory, and then there was there's so many protests, and a lot of people, this makes me really upset, but they were calling it like a coup when really it was fraud.
Right.
But anyway, he ended up fleeing to Mexico, and all this talk again reminds me of a lot of the similarities. So AMLO now is trying to dismantle basically the national
INE,
which I think is
the
National Electoral Institute.
Right. Right.
Instituto Nacional de las Elecciones.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're basically, these Mexican lawmakers are trying to pass like sweeping measures to basically overhaul it. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh my gosh, yeah. This was a big topic of some of our in the lives of some of our Mexico City friends over the weekend who went
Right.
to these marches. There have now been 2 mass marches in Mexico City in the past few months for the defense of INE. You know, we've talked about in previous podcasts that Mexico is effectively like a one-party authoritarian kind of managed dictatorship, basically from the end of the Mexican Revolution, about 100 years back, until the election of 2000, when kind of INE arises and these independent institutions arise that actually allow Mexico. So everything that's gone wrong in Mexico, one of the things that went right in the past 20 years was that they actually did establish a somewhat reasonably nonpartisan, transparent national election system. Now, the reason that they did this was rooted in, for example, the election of 1988, which was absolutely stolen, no question about that. Then you had the election of 1994, in which the Dedazo candidate, the pre-candidate, was actually shot in the head at a rally. And then so 2000 comes along, and sort of like the moral and pragmatic ability of the authorities to rig the election was gone. So you get a PAN candidate, Vicente Fox, who wins in 2000, Calderon in 2006, and then 2 elections hence we have the man we have now, AMLO. The problem is that the current Mexican president, AMLO, is a product really of the 1970s, 1980s PRI rule, when he was a member of the PRI's left faction, and it really has no use for these independent institutions. And so for him, it's, do they enable me to win or not? It's a very direct transactional approach. And so there's not a sense of stewardship for the nation in this thought that, hey, we need to support this electoral institute, which basically manages and validates Mexican elections at the national level in order to, have a sense of continuity with the nation. For him, it's independent. It's something that in his mind, now he has this legendarium in his head that INE has participated in stealing elections from him.
2006, right?
2006 and also in 2012. So he did it twice. Now, 2006 was the really serious one. So in 2006, he does come very, very close to winning the presidency. Felipe Calderon
1%
wins it. Yeah,
right?
like less than 1%, I believe. It was very close. But it was actually a well-monitored election. There was obviously like post-election audits that went on, and Calderon was the winner, no question about that. But AMLO, turned his followers out, and they occupied the center of Mexico City, and he staged basically a sham swearing in where he was sworn in. I think they called him like the people's president or something like that. So there was a moment at which it became a very dangerous moment for Mexico. Now, fortunately, it passed because sort of the moment evaporated, but he believed it. Like AMLO still believes 1,000% that Calderon stole this election from him. And then in 2012, he runs again, doesn't win, and actually he loses by quite a bit more to Peña Nieto. Yeah, a lot more in this one. And he says the same thing, and he says, I'm going to come out with proof. And then he just doesn't, and he kind of disappears. But, you have a guy who ascends to the presidency in 2018, having twice in the preceding, decade plus asserted that he was robbed of this election. Well, INE presides over the elections. Therefore,
Right.
INE is the mechanism that defrauds him and cheats him. And in his mind, because he is the representative of the whole people, they cheat the whole people of Mexico. So now what's happening is his party, the Morena party, which is we've talked about it before. It's a very personalist party. It really exists to kind of validate him and his ideas for Mexico. Is they're not abolishing INE, but they're defunding it, basically. So, what can you do without funding? Not much. And so INE is really not going to be able to effectively monitor elections nationally anymore under this bill that has passed, El Congreso, and is going to go for AMLO's signature. And AMLO's going to sign it. He's very interested in having this happen. So these marches have happened. It's very opaque to me whether or not civic opposition to this is going to achieve anything, just given how the Mexican system is set up. But it's a very sad moment, and it coming, you mentioning the conviction of Garcia Luna. It's a very interesting moment to have the destruction of INE, or the de facto destruction of INE, come closely paired with the conviction of Garcia Luna, which was in Brooklyn, right? It was at the federal court in Brooklyn. Because what the AMLO messaging, what the Morena messaging has been is that Garcia Luna obviously was Felipe Calderon's guy, security chief, and so what the argument you've seen them announcing on Twitter, which is actually a gigantic source for Mexican political comment.
Yeah.
It's just as bad there as it is in the United States. Is that we're gutting INE because INE put into power people like Garcia Luna and Calderon who protected him, and so there's this mythos that arises like Felipe Calderon, whose only real sin was beating AMLO in a fair election, now is presiding over this age of corruption, which the Americans have unwittingly, I think, kind of helped further. And so what you've seen with a lot of the comment from the Morenistas and kind of the Obradoristas on Twitter is the people in the street are just marching because they love Garcia Luna. The people in the street who want INE, they really want the corruption of the Calderon era back. Now we can know this is a farce, right? Because like every metric, corruption, murder, cartel activity are all much worse under AMLO than they are under Calderon. But the contours of Mexican civics, which really does, I don't know if it's a majority, but a substantive number of Mexicans really just hold anything perceived as conservadurismo in contempt. It's almost an epithet in a lot of the discourse. Buys it, and there's a power in it. And so, I think, we have to look at what's happening here as almost a turning point, not just because of the conviction of Garcia Luna, which is a good thing, and it's evidence, by the way, that really only the Americans can bring some accountability to this, but it's also a point at which I think we're progressively seeing the mask come off of the Morena leadership and AMLO himself.
Yeah, and I'm glad you tied that back to Garcia Luna's trial, because we have seen like AMLO is loving it. Mm-hmm. Like he's now able to point to their administration and compare it to his and basically point to how dysfunctional it was.
Yeah.
But his is not much better.
No.
And so it's, I think, something that I want to pick your brain on and something that I'm curious about is I also, when I initially heard about what he's doing to dismantle INE, I thought he's butthurt. He's butthurt about the elections, and he wants to get him back in a way.
Don't get technical on me.
Yeah, well, he's acting kind of irrational because he's so mad that he lost those elections.
Right.
But then he is coming out and saying that they're inefficient and they're spending too much money and there's better ways to do things. But what I can't seem to figure out is people love him. Like he's doing really well, and his party, the Morena party, like they are predicted to win the next presidential election as well, his protege. And so I'm just really curious about why he's doing this now. Why he would create a situation in which people are going to doubt the legitimacy of the next election when they are very predicted to win. Yeah. Like, what is the point of creating that? Obviously, critics are saying it's unconstitutional, that they're going to basically stop Mexico from ever having free elections again.
Right.
So why is he doing something like that makes everybody question him when he's already doing so well?
When Morena could probably win, regardless in the next election. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't think you can rule out. And look, I have no inside information on AMLO's decision making. I don't think anybody does, but him. You cannot rule out personal impulsivity when it comes to this type of a committed messianic populist leader. I have seen it written, and I can't evaluate this. I don't have the basis on which to evaluate it, but it sounds credible to me, so take that for what it's worth. But I've seen it written that INE ended up getting gutted because essentially the director made the mistake of going into public press and pushing back against an insult that the president had thrown their way. And that was enough to start the wheels turning, like, oh, you're going to insult me? Well, guess what? I'm going to disestablish you. And it may be as simple as that. There may be no larger plan. And to your point, it's not at all clear that Morena was ever in any kind of electoral danger. The opposition in Mexico is in terrible shape. No question about it. I mean, there have been sort of these desultory efforts to have like this PAN-PRI alliance, and like the kind of the shambling remnants of the PRD might join it, but nothing will come of it. And I haven't seen any evidence there really is any kind of like this vitality to a political opposition that has any short-term prospects of success. So why did he do it? The answer might be because he could. Why did Xi Jinping crush Hong Kong? There was no need to do that too, but he could. It sends a message. It establishes a new respect and paradigm of rule, and that may have been the whole of the rationale behind it. We don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting, not just with a lot of the things that AMLO has already done, but with this more recent development, is that one of the articles that we've been talking about all week, David Frum's new piece, it's titled, what's it titled? I love the title. That's why I want to read it. Okay. It's called Liberal Democracy in Mexico is Under Assault. Worse, the attacker is the country's own president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Those are powerful words.
Yeah.
And what stood out to us about this article is we wouldn't have expected someone like David Frum to come out and say something like that. And not just that, but we're seeing a lot of the even American left starting to realize the true colors here.
Right.
And so I want to ask you about that. And then one other thing I would like you to touch on is at the State of the Union address, Joe Biden's State of the Union address, he came out and he had this quote. It was something like, in the past 2 years, we've seen democracies around the world get stronger, not weaker. And right next door, we're seeing like the Mexican democracy falling apart.
Right.
And so I want to ask you about that too. Like, is he just tone deaf? Is he ignoring it? Is it our place to do something about it?
Right.
What do you think?
Right. I mean, those are some big questions. Let me set aside the question of President Biden's analytic competency to a second tier on this one. The David Frum article that you're talking about ran in the Atlantic. It's called The Autocrat Next Door, and it's actually a very good piece on AMLO. It seems to hit a lot of the themes that we've been talking about here at the Foundation for some time, which is a bit surprising because the Atlantic it's not a bad magazine. I actually ended up paying for a subscription so I could download this particular article because I wanted to see it. So we'll see if I regret that in months to come. But The Atlantic, which is a storied American magazine, I think it goes back to 1854, 57, something like that. At one time in its existence was kind of this vital organ of American intellectual life. It's really not now. No, the Atlantic's sort of purpose in existence is to serve as a sort of a house organ for sort of this gauzy center-left consensus for people who think high-speed rail is going to be the next big American thing. So which is fine. I mean, we all love trains. But at the same time, I was very surprised to see any kind of original analysis in the Atlantic. But Frum's, got this piece, and it is full credit. It's a good piece. It's good analysis. I don't agree with every particular on it, but the big things that David Frum gets right are pretty big. There's an autocrat next door. Mexican democracy is under threat. Now, we should understand some of the sources of this analysis. A lot of what drives sort of like the center-left commentary at turning on AMLO, which again is a very surprising development. You just didn't see this in the conversation prior to a few weeks back. Is this sense, this perception that AMLO is a metaphorical stand-in for Donald Trump. Now AMLO has done some things that have managed to kind of provoke that reflex in sort of our media betters. Notably, he was one of the last world leaders, if not the last, to congratulate Biden on his election victory. And so he's sort of stepped into this role himself. But beyond that, I would say that the comparison is, aside from aesthetics, is fairly preposterous. I mean, whatever you want to say about President Trump, wasn't an autocrat, wasn't a dictator. But AMLO is, certainly wasn't a narco autocrat by any sense. So there is that element of it, and there is also the reality that there is a class, there's a stratum of Mexican society that is much better connected in Washington, D.C. than it is within Mexican politics, and the rise of Morena has accelerated that. And again, these are people fond of tweeting, but so you can see who they are really on Twitter and figure out who they are. But there is a social aspect to this as well. You've got individuals who are very well connected with what I would describe as kind of the Democratic center left in the United States. And they've managed to get their message out, and they managed to get it through these organs. And so you see David Frum, you see Ann Applebaum, you see other individuals who at any other given time can be reliably counted on to kind of advance what I call like the corporatist Democrat line. That, I'm not saying that as an insult, by the way. I think it's accurately descriptive. Suddenly having this opinion on Mexico that's actually kind of accurate, kind of based.
Yeah.
You just have to understand where it's coming from. Now that being said, from a policy perspective, we ought not care what the motivation is. We should be glad that welcome on board.
Right.
In the infamous words of or famous words of John McClane in Die Hard, "Welcome to the party, pal." It's good to see that there's this recognition, and I actually think that for those of us who are conservatives, especially conservatives in Washington, D.C., there's a policy space opening up, a very fruitful one, to start to impose accountability on the Mexican side for a lot of the things they have gotten away with for so long. Now, all that said, because the policy space has opened up, doesn't mean we're on the verge of that from a policy perspective. I still believe that the Biden administration's number one concern with Mexico remains, probably a tie between climate policy on one hand and migration policy that doesn't embarrass them too much on the other hand. And that's really probably it. We know that the ambassador, Ken Salazar, this has been extensively reported in the New York Times, is actually a friend of AMLO's, very close with him, appears at the Mañaneras. And so I don't think we're on the verge of an era of accountability at all. But I think the fact that you can read The Atlantic of all places and see this kind of critique means that, if you want to fast forward X number of years, and seeing how events play out, and God forbid there's a bad one, but if there is, just as China has become a bipartisan issue, there's actually a fairly broad bipartisan consensus on China now.
Yeah,
I can see the outline of a bipartisan consensus on Mexico too, and candidly, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up because
Please.
Biden's policy approach to Mexico, because I want to use that and tie it back to something that happened last week, which is a vastly different policy approach. I would even say maybe even radical in today's standards. And that is last week, Vivek Ramaswamy announced his candidacy for U.S. president.
Yeah.
He's running as a Republican.
He's a good guy.
He's actually going to be here at TPS.
He is. He is. Yeah, no, he is. Please tell the listeners, though, about it.
Yeah.
What he's going to do. Yeah.
Well, he is a multimillionaire entrepreneur. He's an author.
Right.
He's going to be running for president. And one of the things that he's running on is he wants to decimate Mexican cartels.
Yeah.
And he wants to do it in a way that I've never really heard people talking about it that way before, but he wants to use the U.S. military to basically crack down on this threat. Missiles, drones, troops, all of it.
Right.
He sees that as the most important thing that he can do.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this approach? I'm curious.
Yeah, don't threaten me with a good time. By the way, we should note for the listeners that TPS is the annual Texas Policy Summit that the Texas Public Policy Foundation runs each year.
Our biggest event of the year.
Our biggest event of the year. It's running March 1st through 3rd. So if you're listening to this, it's probably too late to come. But next year, mark your calendars.
And we'll be virtual. All of our panels will be virtual. So people can still tune in.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So go to texaspolicy.com and sign up for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. You're a good steward of the organization. Vivek, very interesting guy, and is set aside any comment on his candidacy. His idea for this is. I'll put it this way: it's pushing the conversation in the right direction. I want to be clear what I mean by that. I don't mean that I want to get us to a point where we're bombing Mexico. That's actually not a prudential end state. No, I really don't. That's not the prudential end state that we think is fruitful here.
Right.
But what is the proper use of American power? What is American governance for? What is the governance of any state or nation for? These are the questions that should be asked first and foremost. And what I think Ramaswamy is doing correctly, fruitfully, is spurring these conversations. America has a lot of commitments abroad. There's a lot of dissent and conversation. Yeah. And again, it's a good conversation to have, especially among conservatives, about what that commitment looks like. And, to put my cards on the table, I'm much more on the internationalist side. I think that a lot of my good friends, people whom I respect and admire, are on the right these days. That being said, I think it is absolutely correct to be asking the question, why is it that the United States of America is so eager to defend Ukraine's borders, but so unwilling to defend the border of Texas and Mexico? Why is it that we have Americans at war killing bad guys in Syria, but they're not killing the bad guys in Sonora? Why is it that we have committed to the defense of the South Korean northern border, but we have not committed to the defense of the U.S. southern border?
Yeah.
All this, you can name almost any overseas American military commitment. And that's not to argue against those military commitments. We're a nation that has a role in the world. But we have to understand the purpose of governance ultimately is to ensure the perpetuation of the political community. And one of the essential features of that is self-defense.
Defending our own turf.
Defending our own. Yeah, defending our own. And look, if I were Mexican, I would say the same thing, except in the opposite direction, right? And so right now we know that there is a robust quasi-state, quasi-military, increasingly capable cartel infrastructure linked with the state below the southern border. You don't have to go far south of the southern border. If you walk 10 feet off the bridge heading southbound in Nuevo Laredo, you will encounter the agents of this state. They might rob you. At very least, they're going to mark you out and figure out who you are.
Yeah.
And so is it legitimate to talk about U.S. military power? Set aside whether you think it's prudential, because again, I'm not sure that it is. But is it legitimate to talk about it? Yes, 1,000%. And I'm glad that Ramaswamy, and he's not the only one, former President Trump has also raised this.
Yeah.
So the more candidates, the more people who are seeking office, who aspire to it, or who are holding office, who talk about this, I think it just pushes the conversation in exactly the direction that it needs to go.
Right.
Ultimately, Mexicans got to solve this. Mexicans have to figure this out. My dream scenario is the Mexican military, unfettered by cartel connections, being the one to bring justice and accountability and, frankly, destruction to these cartels. That's what I want to see. I want to see Sedena under arms doing that. But the option for the United States to do it ought to be on the table. It must. Otherwise, we don't mean anything as a state or a nation.
Absolutely. And I agree with you entirely that I'm really glad to see him talking about this. He's taking the conversation in a really positive direction. And I know we don't have too much time, but he said something else in one of these videos where he was discussing his very bold approach of using the U.S. military to protect our home.
Sure.
He says that a lot of people, a lot of Republicans in the U.S. have been talking about things that are, quite frankly, he puts it as meek, policies that are very meek. And one of the policies that he names is designating cartels, such as the Sinaloa cartel,
Sure.
Nueva Generación Jalisco cartel, as terrorist organizations.
Right.
And he says that that is just too soft and that you need to go bin Laden on them. He said that. And that I suppose he doesn't believe that designating them as foreign terrorist organizations, being able to freeze their assets, he doesn't think that's going to do much good. You have to fight fire with fire.
Right.
So what do you think about that? Because I know that this last week, the Attorney General of Virginia, along with 17 other Attorney Generals?
Something like that, yeah.
They petitioned,
including Texas.
Yeah, including Texas.
Right.
They petitioned President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to name these cartels
as
terrorist organizations.
Right.
So what do you think about all this?
Well, I would respectfully dissent on the description of the proposed policy as weak. A foreign terror designation is quite serious. It's possible to apply it weakly, which I suppose is always the danger, especially with the Biden administration in charge. But no, it's a reasonably strong measure. But we should understand what it is. And by the way, if we're going to invoke going bin Laden, I mean bin Laden ended up, shuffling off the mortal coil at the hands of a SEAL because he was a leader of a foreign terror organization, and also because there was an AUMF. So it was kind of a dual, in terms of like legal authority, is kind of a dual track thing. Look, a foreign terror designation, refers to specific statutory and regulatory authority that carries with it particular contexts and follow-on effects. So you can't finance them, you can't be involved in support for them, and so on. And so what it's designed to do. And by the way, we should be clear that it was that like this body of law and regulation was designed with effectively like the Middle East in mind, right? Like to a lesser extent, if it were just like Irish Republican terrorism, it probably wouldn't look the same. But it's designed with that, and so this idea that it's directly appropriate to like a Mexican context where there's we don't have a lot of fiscal or trade or commerce intercourse with northern Syria, right, or like ISIS-controlled territories. We have a ton of that. Immigration, people, finance, goods with cartel-controlled territories in Mexico. And so what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a foreign terror designation. And by the way, the foundation is currently conducting research on this. You and I have been working on it for quite some time. So cross your fingers, hopefully out soon. But one of the challenges we have to face is you don't want to have a foreign terror designation for Mexican cartels that ends up accidentally rendering, broad swaths of South Texas liable to prosecution because they, without any
could happen
without any mens rea component, right? Without intending to, they might have done business with the cartel. So, I think if there's a small credit union in the Rio Grande Valley that unknowingly, has been, holding cartel funds, I would not be in favor of prosecuting those people if there's no mens rea component. All of which is to say you have to do it in a deliberate fashion. Now, one of the things, and I suspect, I'm not going to speak for Ramaswamy, and obviously it's worth repeating, we're a 501c3 organization, we're not partisan, we don't have any, we take no position on elections or candidates. So this is a purely policy opinion. But if Vivek is interested in a more muscular approach that avoids kind of the intricacies of FTO designations, then one of the ideas that we've heard on Capitol Hill from my conversations on Capitol Hill, and you and I have had conversations about this, is an authorization for use of military force, an AUMF. And so we've seen draft AUMF language come up, I believe, from Representatives Crenshaw and Walsh in the new House majority. That strikes me as an idea worth exploring. Now, again, the devil's in the details, so we need to think about it. But am I automatically opposed to it? By no means. So the virtues of an AUMF, at least as I understand it is currently conceived, is that you simply sidestep the necessity of designating particular entities and those who do business with them, those who interact with them in any particular way, and you just now have an authorization for the executive branch to use military force when deemed appropriate. And in full candor, I can see a virtue in that. It has the virtue of simplicity. But as with all things, policy theory and policy execution are not the same, and it is policy execution that matters most. And for that, you need the right people in charge of policy.
Absolutely. I don't know how much time we have left, but do you have anything else you want to mention? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I want to end where we began on this idea of Mexican nationhood. One of the interesting things that you can see in El Centro, and so the historic center of Mexico City, is actually the grave, the final resting place of Hernán Cortés. If you have never read, have you ever read Bernal Díaz's Conquest of New Spain?
I don't know. That sounds familiar. I feel like that's one of the things that they would have made me read back in high school.
I hope you have.
I don't think so.
You would not forget it if you had. I'll put it that way. So Bernal Díaz, who's one of the conquistadors who comes with Cortés after 1519 and actually helps conquer Tenochtitlan, which becomes Mexico City, ends up later in life writing this history of the conquest of New Spain. Everybody should read it, Mexican, non-Mexican. It's one of the greatest adventure stories ever that was set down on paper. It's rousing, it's incredible, and it's a window into a heroic age that is sadly very gone. But you cannot emerge from reading Bernal Díaz's account without having, whether or not you like him, I think is irrelevant, but you must have an admiration for the will and the courage and the canniness of Hernán Cortés, who leads this. And it is Cortés who later on ends up marrying the daughter of Montezuma and actually ends up having children with her. And so he is in a literal sense the creator of the synthesis of Spanish and Aztec that becomes modern Mexico, that becomes this synthesis nation. You would think that foundational figure, that creator, would be, if not honored, then respected in Mexico. The reality is completely the opposite. It took me quite a while to find the grave of Hernán Cortés in Mexico City, and what I found is that he is at a small, otherwise unremarkable parish. He's buried next to the altar, and there's a small plaque marking him, and it is forbidden to take photographs of his grave. The reason is twofold. One is there is a general sentiment in Mexican nationalism that he is not a man to be honored, that he brought Spanish dominion to Mexico for 500 years, 300 years, 300 years, sorry. But the other reason is practical. There's a danger that Mexican nationalists, a perennial danger that Mexican nationalists will actually desecrate the body and ransack the grave. And so there's not an interest in popularizing it. That is, to me, as an outsider, I almost say as a non-Mexican. I am half Mexican, but I'm Texan first, American first. That to me is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Mexican nationalism, and I think as an observer, it's the question that defines the tension within it in almost any age. To what extent are they that nation of synthesis, and to what extent are they continually in this long-term rejection of the act of creation that brought them into being? Right now, they have a president who prefers the latter, and I suspect on a socio-cultural level that they will find their fulfillment in a credible figure who can do the former. And that's my last thought.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to close it. Thank you, Josh, as always, for your incredible perspective and for your expertise. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This is Hard Country. We'll see you next time.